Hello, and welcome to the first episode of The Sceptic, the Daily Sceptic's weekly podcast where I interview the authors of some of our most talked about recent pieces. I'm your host, Laurie Wastel, Associate Editor of the Daily Sceptic. Coming up on the show this week, I speak to Chris Morrison, the Daily Sceptic's Environment Editor, about some good news about the climate that has been strangely overlooked by the mainstream media.
1, 2, 3, 4! Occupation Rome!
Norwegian journalist Kathrine Jebsen-Moore on why she feels ashamed of her country's recent decision to recognise Palestine as a state, and law professor David McGrogan on why human rights law is being used not to defend individual rights, but to increase the power of the state. But before all that, I'm pleased to be joined by the editor-in-chief of the Daily Sceptic, Toby Young, who's going to tell me a bit about the new podcast. So Toby, thanks for being here. And what's the idea behind The Sceptic?
So, hi Laurie, welcome aboard. So we did have a podcast that was associated with the Daily Sceptic called The Weekly Sceptic, which is something I still do with Nick Dixon. But we've now spun that off into a separate business, and it no longer has much connection to the Daily Sceptic other than my involvement. So I thought we should probably have a dedicated Daily Sceptic specific podcast in which a host, you, interview writers of some of our most talked about, most widely read pieces that we published recently, so our readers get a chance to get to know some of our most frequent authors and get to hear a bit more about their articles that they've recently published.
So where will this podcast be available?
So initially, Laurie, the podcast will be available for free either on YouTube, or you can watch it on the website via an embedded YouTube video. That's the video version. Or you can listen to it via Podbean, which enables you to listen to it on your favorite podcasting app, or it'll be embedded on the website as well. But the plan is, in due course, to include some premium content in the podcast, so extended interviews with some of our favourite writers, some additional content as well. I was thinking about introducing a section in which we ask people what their favourite dystopian movie or novel is. So there'll be some additional premium content in the podcast in due course, and we'll put that in a new premium section which we're creating on the website. We're not launching it yet, it's not quite ready. We thought we'd launch the podcast ahead of it being ready, but in due course, maybe in September, possibly sooner, we'll introduce this new premium section on the Daily Sceptic website where you'll be able to access the premium content on the podcast, whether orally or visually. And in addition, there'll be other premium content, so people will be able to access our new Discord server, which you're going to be in charge of, and that will mean that they can have conversations with me and you and some of our contributors, and also start discussion threads. It'll be like a gussied up version of the forum which we did have on the Daily Sceptic. If people want to have extended conversations instead of just talking to each other below the line, which they'll still be able to do, they can also create a dedicated discussion thread about a topic they're particularly interested in. And in addition, we'll probably be publishing some articles in that premium section that aren't available to everyone. But all of this will be available to our existing premium subscribers, people paying £5 a month or £50 a year or more than that, so they can comment below the line or just because they want to support us. The new premium section of the website will be available. Everything in there will be available to them. They won't have to pay any more. But the idea is to create some additional incentives so we get more people paying £5 a month or more, or £50 a year. So they won't just be able to comment below the line in return for that. They'll also be able to access this new premium section on the website. We think this is the way to make the business sustainable over the long term.
Okay, that sounds great. And so is there anything more you'd like to add?
Well, I should just say, welcome, Laurie, to the Daily Sceptic. You first crossed my radar, I think, when you became a free speech champion, which was a program the Free Speech Union set up for students and recent graduates who wanted to promote free speech, defend free speech at their universities, in the workplace. And I've followed your writing career since then with great interest and admiration. Been reading your stuff in Spiked, The Critic, The Spectator. It's really good. And I'm delighted that you've joined us as an associate editor at the Daily Sceptic, and really looking forward to the first podcast, and better let you get on with it.
So my first guest this week is Chris Morrison, the Daily Sceptic's environment editor. I'm pleased to be joined by down the line now from Wimbledon. Welcome, Chris. So if I was just following the mainstream media, I'd be under the impression of two things: that cows are terrible for the planet and that farming is getting much more difficult because of climate change. Now, how true are both of those things?
Well, it's certainly incorrect to say that climate change is particularly affecting agriculture, because you only have to look at the data. This is the data that is more or less ignored, it seems, in mainstream media. But the crop yields are just going through the roof. Now, part of that is due to improvements in land management and fertilizer. We could talk about that, in fact, since the net zero fanatics want to ban nitrogen fertilizer, because yet again, that's another thing that seems to be altering the climate. So we had a story, so readers probably would have seen it, looking at two things. Yes, one was that a new science paper that showed that crop yields in China had soared enormously in the last, going back almost to the 1960s. And this was attributed by these scientists to warmer temperatures and more CO2 in the atmosphere. And at the same time, because of course we're told that warmer temperatures will lead to us all being washed away in floods and rain, they found that in China, the precipitation rates were more or less stable over this period. And so what China has managed to do, the Great Chinese Revolution, it's a shame we're not slightly more friendly with them than we are at the moment, because for the first time in their history, the Chinese people are not faced with famine and starvation because of these enormous improvements, particularly in food, obviously, or because it's industrialized as well. I mean, China is an enormous success story of industrial development. And of course, they're not, they're paying lip service to net zero, but it's just for the birds, really. It's just for us, really. So the food yields have gone up, and the food yields have gone up regularly around the world. The great story that is not being shown on mainstream media is that it's also due to the greening of the Earth. The NASA satellites suggest that the Earth is greened by 14%. By that I mean the amount of leaf cover picked up by satellites over 40 years. Again, another science paper that we covered in detail in the Daily Sceptic found that in the last 20 years alone, not only had the greening effect become quite pronounced, but it had accelerated. And this is with fairly low levels of CO2, because if people who might read my copy know, I'm more of a fan of CO2. I don't think that CO2 is an enormous problem. If it is, well, let's see the science that suggests it is. And certainly in a period of denudation, which we were approaching pre-industrialization, we've now had a small improvement in CO2, still far, far lower than levels that we've seen almost throughout the 600 million years of paleoclimatic records. And as a result, we are seeing this improvement in plants. Plants themselves have a DNA that they think is really... It takes in about 1,000 parts per million, 1,000 parts per million CO2. We're currently at 420. Plants thrive best at about 1,000, and that's because all their ancestors going back millions of years, they were the levels that they had. And so plants grow much quicker when there's more CO2. So all of these stories, say the increasing yields of food, the greening of the earth, are all more or less ignored in mainstream media.
Okay, so thanks, Chris, for telling us about those lesser-known good news climate stories. And of course, part of the reason you've had to do that is because most people won't have heard of them in the mainstream media. So why do you think this kind of good news is so rarely reported?
Well, this is obviously very bad media bias. The media is almost completely corrupted by bias whenever they talk about the climate. And they do it all the time. And then their biggest sin is a sin of omission. They just simply ignore it. They're running into a political narrative. And again, as we talk about in the Daily Sceptic, that narrative is a net zero collectivization. It's a deindustrialization that's been planned by many elites across the world. It's not a conspiracy theory. You can read about it in what they say and what they write and all this sort of stuff. And they are planning a major deindustrialization under the guise of net zero, under the guise in particular of a climate emergency. So anything that suggests that the climate is not collapsing doesn't appear to be particularly welcome in mainstream media. So I'll give you one or two other examples, which again, readers of Daily Sceptic will be well informed about, slightly better informed than say, BBC, Sky and ITV. For instance, the Arctic sea ice. is engaged in a small recovery, a cyclical recovery. And it has been for at least 10 years. If you look at the summer sea ice, the minimum, it's at the same sort of levels as it was 10 years ago. And of course, what they do in the mainstream media is they draw a line down from 1979, which happens to be the year when accurate satellite measurements came along, but there were satellite measurements before that. And we have a pretty good idea of the ice. We know had observations going back to the 1800s, naval observations, for instance. And we know that the ice is cyclical, the Arctic sea ice. And we know that 1979 was a particular high point. It was much, much lower in the 60s and the 50s, we think. And so what they do is they draw a line. There was a major drop for about a decade or so. I think it was about 1990 or so. But I say since 2007, and certainly for the last decade, the decline has dramatically stopped. Doesn't stop people like Sir David Attenborough quoting climate models, telling us recently on BBC that the summer sea ice would very likely be gone by 2035. All these alarmists looking forward to swimming galas, if you like, near the North Pole. They've all been extremely disappointed because the ice hasn't really hasn't played ball. Partly that's because the temperatures have risen slightly in the Northern Hemisphere. They've risen much higher in the Northern Hemisphere than they have in the Southern Hemisphere, which is a very natural climatic process because there is more land in the Northern Hemisphere, which warms up quicker. But we think that the Arctic ice, for instance, is controlled by the AMO, which is a decadal oscillation, a natural current. There are many others in the world. They think it's caused much more by something like that. And if it turns one way or turns the other, it brings in warmer or cooler waters, and that has much more effect on the ice than perhaps marginal rises of air temperature above it. All of these things are used when there's bad news or when there's a turn for what they think is bad news. And then as soon as the cyclical nature of this occurs, it's simply ignored. It's just dropped from the headlines. And they move on to the next bad weather or whatever they're wanging on about, sea surface temperatures or something like that. They're all trying to suggest that the El Nino is a minor part, and so the recent rise in temperatures is all due to carbon dioxide. And they're back on the usual hobby horses without any real explanations given to what scientists genuinely think, because this is what real scientists will look at. They will look at all of the causes. That's what we try to do on Daily Sceptic. And so we try to give a voice, if you like, to a lot of the scientific work that goes under the radar, that simply doesn't follow the narrative.
So, of course, for the average person, they're really only getting one side of that narrative. So how do you think that affects people's perception of the world?
Well, I suppose the worst effect is that quite a few people think that we ought to take out hydrocarbons from a modern industrial society. And I cannot think of a more insane idea if I tried. First of all, there's a complete lack of understanding of what hydrocarbons do. They not only warm our houses, but they're in everything we do. They're in medicines, they're in plastics, they're in soft contact lenses, they're in food preservatives. They wrap the food that keeps it fresh. They're in everything. And what if you just stop oil? If you just stop drilling oil, like the Labour Party is apparently, no more new oil and gas licenses. It's not just we're going to have heat pumps. We're going to have alternative lenses and medicines and goodness knows what. Hydrocarbons are a very valuable resource. And what it's done is it's persuaded an inordinate number of people, some of whom are, very highly educated, that going to net zero is a good thing. It's not. It's a ridiculous idea, and it's promoted by a confluence, I think, of influences of people who are obviously communists, who are Marxists, left wing, who believe the state ought to run everything. A confluence with extreme environmentalists, and they've been around for 100 years or so. A confluence of a lot of people who rely on the state and don't really understand how wealth is created. They have no real education and idea about how of science, of chemistry, of the way that these things are put together, how plastics are put together. They have no idea of how we keep warm. And they have no idea, it seems to me, of the science around climate change. And that includes, of course, most politicians, and it would appear most journalists who just reproduce what they're told to in press releases issued by people supporting the net zero narrative. So the really bad effect is that a lot of people think, for some inexplicable reason, that it's a good idea to remove hydrocarbons from an industrial society. It's not just not a good idea, it's actually impossible. Well, if it was possible, we would all be back in the Dark Ages. Literally, we would all be back in the Dark Ages. We remove nitrogen fertilizer, for instance, where I was talking about the crop yields. Yes, it's improved by CO2. Yes, it's improved by a little extra warmth. Well, crops grow much better in these things, but the crop yields would fall dramatically, and these are staples that the world's population relies on. You would have billions of people dying of famine. Literally, I mean, we have 8 billion people on this planet, and they can only survive if we add nitrogen fertilizer to the land. Now, you can make a scare story about how it's causing, whatever gas, greenhouse gas, to enter the atmosphere. But you've got to be prepared that if you go to a true net zero, an absolute net zero, which is really what they want, you've got to be prepared for the most horrendous economic, social consequences. Because when human beings, we know this from history, when things get tight, human beings start to fight. And in the past, empires only grew by taking from others, by the rich tribes taking from the less rich tribes, because there was very little wealth to go around. The only way you could get rich and powerful was to take from somebody else. Hence, if you look at any historical analysis of warfare, that's what's happened. Do you really want to go back to that? Do you really want to stop this wealth creation? Do you really want to have a class of people who are in favor of deindustrialization? In a way, I would argue that both political parties in this current general election in the United Kingdom seem to be engaged on that process. Because if you go for net zero, you're going for deindustrialization. These are the first political parties in 200 years that are arguing for people to get poorer. And the media is in full compliance with this. It's something to sort of ask politicians on the doorstep, I think, and maybe on another time we can go into, well, if you have to go to net zero because it's an existential crisis, then we have to go. We have to go back to a much darker age, and then of course we look into the fact that, well, let's look at the science. Is the science settled? Is carbon dioxide a problem? All these sorts of things, which again is, in the Daily Sceptic, we also look at. I think it's very important to look at the science for that reason, because if you can show that the science is nowhere settled, that there is a lot of thought that goes into the idea that actually carbon dioxide is beneficial, that little extra warming is beneficial. We live in a very benign climate rather than a collapsing climate. If you can look at the science work that shows that, then maybe people will start to pull away from this crazy idea of net zero.
Now, Norway has recently joined Spain and Ireland in recognising Palestine as a state, a move that has met with praise from Hamas and the departure of the Israeli ambassador to Norway. I'm pleased now to be joined by Kathrine Jebsen-Moore, a journalist for the Norwegian outlet document.no, who's written for the Daily Sceptic recently, telling us why she's ashamed to be Norwegian in the light of this decision. Kathrine, great to have you here. What does this tell us about Norwegian politics?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for having me on, Laurie. So maybe I should just introduce myself briefly before we start. So yes, I am Norwegian, but I live in Scotland. I've lived here for about 20 years now. But I very much follow what's going on in Norway, and I also work for a Norwegian news outlet, a bit like the Daily Sceptic. So yeah, I try to keep my eyes on what's happening there. So I was quite shocked, really, and also quite ashamed of the news that came out that Norway was going to follow Spain and Ireland in recognising Palestine as an independent state. This is quite a shift in Norwegian politics, because Norway has sort of prided itself on being neutral in the Middle East. It's played a role in the past in peacekeeping negotiations. And so this is quite a dramatic shift in politics, really. And I was quite surprised at the move, really. But in a way, it seems to come out of nowhere. But on the other hand, the current people in power in Norway are quite radical, quite on the left, and the foreign minister, Espen Barth Eide, is known to be a long-time supporter of Palestine. So it wasn't a complete surprise to many, I think.
So, of course, in the UK, people have the perception of Norway as this incredibly successful country, incredibly rich, doing very well on all the happiness indexes, very high social trust. Everything seems to be going swimmingly in Norway from our perspective. Do you get a sense that in some ways this explains or even influences the favourability of Norway towards Palestine?
Well, I think it could do. There is a strong link on the Norwegian left to support the Palestinian cause. And it's become very fashionable to support Palestine for some reason. I mean, the main labour organisation supports Palestine. Big portions of the left, which is quite strong in Norway, support them. There's been two parties on the right, the Progress Party and the Conservative Party, who have actually gone out to say that this is a real break with Norwegian tradition and it's quite a dangerous stance to take. But apart from that, the public mood is quite different really in Norway than it is here in Britain, where it's much more nuanced here, I think, and we are much more careful in calling for a two-party solution at this point, although I think many would support that longer term. But, in the current situation, I think it's quite a dangerous idea, really. But yeah, in Norway, it's very, very popular to support Palestine. Many people wear the keffiyeh scarves. Even on the Norwegian National Day a few weeks ago, some people were wearing the scarf with their traditional Norwegian costumes. And celebrities, influencers, vast majority have been very vocal in supporting Palestine. So the public mood is very different, and it really is, it's a change. I don't know exactly how it's happened, but it's a bit like a luxury belief, I think. They don't have anything directly to do with what's going on there, but they still see this as a great cause that they can take up and use to virtue signal, a bit like other causes like Pride and things like that, which have also taken very strong hold in Norway. So, of course, there are Muslims in Norway too who very much support it, and so they work in conjunction with them. And just like in London, they have marches, quite frequent marches in support of Palestine. And Norway has a very, very small Jewish minority. So, unfortunately, this mood is really making it hard for Jews in Norway now to live and feel safe. And I wrote about that a little bit in my article as well. There's Jews saying they want to move to Israel because the current climate in Norway is now becoming quite hostile to Jewish people.
And how do you feel about that?
Well, I'm not Jewish myself, but I grew up with learning in school about the plight of the Jews and the Holocaust. There were some prominent conservative politicians in the past, one named Joe Benkov, who was very vocal about the need to support Jews. And I don't think that's very visible now with today's politicians. I don't think the ruling Labour Party are very good at actually voicing support for Jewish people. And there's a lot of anti-Semitism going on in these marches, and a lot of anti-Israel and anti-Jewish rhetoric floating around, which isn't really being taken very seriously.
So I'm very interested in this question about the internal politics of Norway. So obviously you mentioned in the UK, in London, we've had these pro-Palestine marches, and there's kind of two threads going on there. On the one hand, there's the left-wing politics, so the sort of Socialist Workers' Party, Jeremy Corbyn, Novara Media style leftism. But then on the other hand, there's kind of the Muslim identity politics part of it. So obviously London has a fairly sizable Muslim population, and they're sort of more aligned with Palestine on ethno-religious lines. And so there's about 180,000 Muslims in Norway, which is about 3% of the population. And so which of those two strands do you think is most driving the pro-Palestine sentiment in Norwegian politics?
Well, I think it's being led by the left-wing progressives. But then they have a very sizable amount of the population now is Muslim. I mean, compared to the Jewish population, it's absolutely vast. So they rely on the immigrant votes. So I think that's a big part of it. but also there are a lot of very radical people in Norwegian politics. And the difference, I suppose, with the British Labour Party and the Norwegian Labour Party is that in Norway you have the Corbyn types in power at the moment. It is the left that is dominating the party. So for them, this is a very natural place to be at the moment, is to actually take on the Palestinian cause. And they don't seem too worried about this break in Norwegian tradition, really, of being neutral, of trying to see both sides and trying to be a negotiator. And Israel's now said that there is no role for Norway after this latest move. And it's quite telling, really, that Espen Barth Eide, the foreign minister, actually calls the founding of Israel in 1948, he calls that the Nakba, which means the catastrophe. And this is very much Palestinian rhetoric and the Palestinian narrative about the displacement of Palestinians. And he seems to be forgetting that hundreds of thousands of Jews were also displaced from other countries in the Middle East at that time. So it's very, very one-sided at the moment. And I think it's embarrassing for Norway to be to do this. It's like we're sticking out like a sore thumb at the moment compared to our allies in NATO. And I think it's a move to try to calm the very radical left-wing bits of the Labour Party. I think that's a big part of it. And also to secure immigrant votes. I think that is, so it's a two-sided thing. They got support, especially young people, I think, very much being taken in by the, propaganda, really, from Palestine. There's a huge social media presence, which you probably have noticed as well here, but it's very fashionable to wear the keffiyeh scarf, to symbolise that you agree with their cause. They just have momentum at the moment, I suppose. And that's why I just think it's very important to just say that this isn't the whole story. Why are we going down this route of supporting a violent terrorist organisation in the Middle East? To me, it's quite shameful, really.
So, of course, part of the reason for Britain's favourability towards Israel is more our domestic politics, but also there is foreign policy aspect of it. And of course, Britain's quite close to America in its foreign policy, and America is generally a fairly big supporter of Israel. And so I wonder if Norway, part of the reason it feels able to sort of, go against the pack in this is that Norway, unlike Britain, feels it's got great energy security, for instance, and in some sense it feels like it doesn't really have to listen to America and other parts of NATO, perhaps, and kind of feels it can go its own way.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I mean, there are strong elements in Norway who, on the left especially, that want to sort of assert itself as a different sort of place where, we're sort of above the big politics of the big countries, and we can just say it as it is and that sort of thing, and be critical of America and Britain and NATO. Although it is a big break, really. On the left, historically, we've been sort of very much tied to NATO and to the foreign policies of our allies. So it's quite a dramatic shift, really, and it's hard to know exactly what's going on behind, what's behind their thinking, apart from just virtue signaling and trying to be different for just to be different.
So you mentioned that a lot of this might be considered virtue signaling, and that would suggest that it might be actually quite a shallow political movement. How do you see the future of pro-Palestine sentiment playing out in Norwegian politics?
Well, it's really hard to say because we don't know what's going to happen in the Middle East, really. We don't know that's really, none of Norway's, Norway doesn't have any say really in what's going on, and we'll just have to wait and see what's happening down there, I think, to see if the momentum of this movement can keep going and if their policies will change as a result of what's going to happen. I suppose we're all hoping for peace and peace down in the Middle East, because it's quite scary, really, with what's going on in the world. It's not, there's lots of conflicts in different parts of the world at the moment, and a bit more stability, would be great. And so we'll just have to wait and see how long this can remain a fashionable cause. It was a bit like Greta Thunberg a few years ago too. I saw that happening in Norway with everyone marching for this as well. And so I don't know what it is about Norway, but they seem quite prone to taking on these causes, sort of global issues, and making them their own. So I don't know what's going to happen next, but at the moment, it seems to be going quite strong.
So you mentioned that Greta Thunberg has had a big influence on the debate in Norway and that there's a strong environmentalist current there. But of course, Norway is a very big oil and gas exporter, perhaps the biggest in Europe. And so how do those threads, which are really very much in conflict, how do they play out in Norwegian politics?
Well, I think there's quite a lot of guilt in Norway because we are so lucky to have all this wealth. And it is such a peaceful, happy place, really. And I think a lot of people, especially on the left, just feel like they need to atone for this and and sort of make amends for, they see a very unfair world where people are struggling in other parts of the world, and they think Norway's contributing with their oil and gas to climate change, and so they can't really do much other than show their support for these causes, I suppose. And I think there's a strong element of that. We don't have our colonial history at all, so that side of sort of anti-racism and that sort of thing hasn't been as strong in Norway because we don't have that history. But when it comes to the environment and other causes, we seem to just take that very strongly on board.
So nowadays, we hear more and more about human rights, but it often seems that we're becoming less and less free. Now, I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. David McGrogan, who's an associate professor of law at Northumbria Law School. And recently, he gave an address to the Danube Institute's Rule of Law conference in Budapest. So welcome, David. So people might not intuitively have a very clear understanding of sort of what human rights law is and how it works. But in your address to the Danube Institute and in your article for us, you have this sort of new way of thinking about it, which is thinking about human rights law as a person with objectives, desires, and motives. Could you just explain that metaphor a bit for us?
Yeah. So the reason, the basic idea behind that metaphor comes from a Hungarian libertarian thinker. He lived most of his life in France. He kind of fled, the communist regime in Hungary, and spent most of his time in France. And he was called Anthony de Jassé. And he wrote a very interesting book in the middle of the 1980s called The State. And in that, it's a very great book, by the way. I highly recommend reading it. But so in that book, he essentially says, if we want to understand the state, then rather than thinking of it as a kind of complicated system of many different layers and many different parts, it's helpful to actually think of it as a person, as an individual person, as though it has motives, as though it has beliefs and opinions and objectives of its own. The reason why he thought that was a good idea to think about the state was because, of course, the state is in the end made up of people, right? Everybody who is within the state apparatus is an individual human being who has motives. And you could think of the state as a kind of product, therefore, of all of the motives of everybody who's involved, all of the civil servants and the politicians and the bureaucrats and the judges and everybody who is involved in the project. Their motives and desires and aims kind of get subsumed together and aggregated. And so thinking of it in that way as an individual person who has motives kind of allows you to cut through a lot of the kind of deep political theory about the state and to understand the way it operates. And so my suggestion in that article was simply, borrowing from de Jassé, what if we were to think of human rights law as a person? If we thought of it in that way, then what would it be doing? What would its purposes be? Allows you then to understand human rights law as a kind of really a mechanism by which the state expands the scope of its influence in society. So most people have an idea in their heads of human rights. If they think about it at all, which most people, let's be perfectly honest, don't do so on a daily basis. But when you do think about it at all, most people think, well, it's a way of limiting the power of the state, right? Like the idea is human beings have human rights, the right to freedom of expression or freedom of association or the right not to be tortured or something like that. And those things kind of form hurdles or barriers to state power. That's kind of like the cliche about what human rights are for. But if you see it the way human rights work, or how human rights work in practice, you get a very, very different image of what human rights law is doing. What human rights law seems to be doing is opening up society to intervention by the state in the name of securing often a vision of equality, combined sometimes quite paradoxically with an ideal of freedom. It's as though human rights law is designed to force the state to render everybody equal and also free. So it's as though human rights law's aim, rather, is to kind of facilitate the scope of state power. And so to give you an interesting example of that, you can't have failed to notice that at the time of the first lockdown, the big original COVID lockdown of March 2020, nobody was talking about the classic ideal of human rights law as restraining state power. Nobody was saying, well, hang on, what about the right to freedom of association? Shouldn't people be allowed to meet each other unrestrained by the strictures of the state? What about the right to liberty? Shouldn't people be able to go where they choose? Shouldn't they be free to do that? Nobody was talking about freedom of conscience. I, for example, don't believe that masks are particularly useful in restricting the spread of respiratory viruses. So shouldn't I be able to express my freedom of conscience in refusing to wear a mask? That kind of a way of thinking about human rights was totally absent, as you will no doubt remember. Instead, if we heard about human rights at all, what we heard was, well, the right to life needs to be protected. Right? So the state needs to ensure that people's right to life is secured, so they're protected from the harm of the virus. By extension, of course, people's right to health ought to be protected, so they ought to be insulated from the spread of COVID. And also non-discrimination, you might remember, or equality. You might remember that a big kind of a discourse at the time of the first lockdown surrounded this idea that COVID has this kind of discriminatory effect. So there's this idea that what the state ought to be doing is keeping people alive, protecting people from becoming sick, and also making sure that the virus affected everybody equally. So that is not a recipe for a small state. So you can see that human rights, in the way it's understood in the contemporary sphere, has very little to do with our kind of classical liberal understanding of what human rights is, that it's a restriction on state power, and instead becomes a vehicle by which the state expands, or a justification for the state expanding. To give you another example, freedom of expression nowadays, you will also have noticed, has kind of taken on this quality. So a lot of people still think of freedom of expression, again, as a kind of a buttress against state power, right? Individual people have the right to express themselves freely. What we nowadays find when human rights advocates in particular talk about freedom of speech is the idea that the state should be carefully regulating what people are allowed to express and the manner in which they express it in order to secure a kind of a greater freedom. So, for example, we mustn't have people making discriminatory comments or expressing themselves in a discriminatory way, because that will, in some respect, diminish the equality or the freedom of other groups in society. We'll also see, for example, the idea that people should be restrained from spreading misinformation or disinformation in the name of freedom of expression, because if disinformation and misinformation is spread, then it will crowd out the freedom of expression of people who are expressing the truth, accurate information. So it's not that the right to freedom of expression is a limit on state power. It actually is designed or thought of as a justification for the expansion of state control over speech in society, a kind of minute, very detailed regulation of speech in society. So it's not really about what we would think of, again, in the classical liberal understanding of freedom as being the state kind of taking its hands off, adopting a laissez-faire sort of approach. It's actually an encouragement to the state to intervene at the very, very granular level of what people individually say at any specific given moment. Are they expressing themselves freely or are they expressing themselves in such a way that will diminish the freedom of somebody else, right? Once you go down that road, you're talking about a very, 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 very interventionist state. In fact, the most interventionist state that you could really imagine.
Right. And so it seems that the human rights person, as you describe it, has a radically different view of what the state should look like from what you might call a classical liberal point of view. I mean, perhaps you would still say that the human rights view is liberal, but it's sort of liberal equalitarianism. It's the idea that the state should have the power to sort of iron out various different kinds of inequalities. And this, I think, there's something you call the end state of liberalism and how it's produced by the human rights person. Could you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah. So the way that liberalism has developed, really, I guess, over the course of 100 years, 150 years, is, as you rightly pointed out, this gradual kind of abandonment of that kind of a negative understanding of freedom as just being the liberty to be left alone, if you want to put it in that way, the liberty to simply live your life and to not be under the authority of the or the management of the state. We've seen a kind of shift towards a vision of liberalism as being a kind of amelioration of the conditions of want, or a kind of liberation from conditions of want and conditions of inequality, almost as though in order for freedom to really be realized, then people need to be liberated from any kind of material restraint on their freedom. So, and that would include, of course, therefore, inequality, right? Because as soon as you have any kind of an inequality in society, that's tantamount to saying that some people are more free than others, or that some people can restrain the freedom of others. So you get this weird sort of paradoxical set of impulses where, on the one hand, we all seem to kind of feel as though freedom is a good thing and we like more freedom, as good liberals. But at the same time, we want everybody to also be equal, because if people aren't equal, then by definition, some are more free than others and some can restrain the freedom of others. So modern kind of liberal government is characterized by this kind of tension between those two impulses, right? We want freedom, but we also want the state to ensure everybody's equal so that then they can be genuinely free. And those two things, of course, are completely irreconcilable, which is why I think liberalism can't really survive in the long term, because those two impulses tug ultimately in completely different directions, right? You can't have a free society in which the state renders everybody equal by definition. That's Friedrich Hayek's argument in The Road to Serfdom, right? If you want to have a society in which everybody is equal, then by definition, that is a society which is not free, right? It's a society of serfs, right? It's a society in which everybody is in effect owned by the state. So you can't reconcile those two impulses, but modern liberalism seems to be characterized by the idea that we should, or that we can. And that explains an awful lot of what we see about us, this weird interplay between those two different, completely irreconcilable drivers or motives. But what happens when you have those two irreconcilable drivers and motives, obviously, is highly productive, at least in as far as it encourages the expansion in the size and scope and power of the state, again, right? Because that tension between those two different drivers results in a need for the state to, again, constantly intervene in society under the rubric of, on the one hand, making everybody equal, and on the other hand, making everybody free, and kind of squaring that circle, and sort of managing society in such a way that that circle can be squared.
I want to create the first smoke-free generation.
A good example, actually, is Rishi Sunak's proposal to gradually ban tobacco smoking, on a kind of age basis. So you'd kind of 16-year-olds would be banned, and then it would gradually increase, the age limit would increase. And Sajid Javid gave a speech in the House of Commons in which he said that, although he's a libertarian, and, Sajid Javid actually, he's known for being a big Ayn Rand enthusiast, right? He reads The Fountainhead every year and, thinks of himself as being a libertarian. But he was absolutely fully in support of the government banning tobacco smoking.
This emergency of public health has many causes, and at the top of that list, it must be smoking, especially cigarettes.
Because in doing so, in the state banning the consumption of tobacco, that in a broader sense will restore freedom to the population, because it will remove the threat of addiction and the threat of ill health, cancer, and the threat of passive smoking and all that kind of thing. So in the interest of a kind of wider freedom, the state needs to ban or regulate tobacco smoking. And so you see that everywhere, this idea that, we need to make people more free. We need to somehow achieve this impossible objective of having everybody being free and everybody being equal. And the way that we achieve that is this kind of micromanagement and tinkering by the state in more or less every aspect of social life. So although it's completely, to make the point again, although it's completely those two imperatives are totally irreconcilable. And although in the end, I think that will kind of tear liberalism apart, at the moment we've got this weird middle ground where that tension actually constantly encourages the growth in the state's micromanagement of society.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting. So you mentioned there's a big tension between kind of the positive liberty view of human rights that human rights generally takes and what others might think of as a negative liberty, freedom from conception of freedom. And obviously we've seen this tension play out a lot in recent years. And the biggest example will be lockdown, where the kind of human rights person, if you like, had very little to say about it. And then, if you think of other issues, perhaps, of course, there's the vaccine mandates, that violating bodily autonomy, and lots of free speech issues. You see a huge push to sort of regulate free speech on the internet at the moment, with initiatives like the Digital Services Act in the EU and the Online Safety Act here. And sort of the human rights freedom defenders don't really have much to say about these kinds of issues. And so to a normal person, it might seem intuitively quite difficult to understand which are the issues that, kind of the human rights person, if we continue to think of it in that way, would have this paradoxical view on. And of course, another one, as you mentioned, is smoking. So how do you sort of think about how it decides which issues kind of matter and which don't?
Yeah, it's a great question, because to kind of go back over a very, very, very brief history of kind of the criticism of human rights, is that for a very, very long time, starting with Karl Marx, there existed a very, very perceptive left-wing critique of human rights law, right? Which was that basically what human rights law does is it produces kind of the stuff of bourgeois capitalist society. What capitalism wants is autonomous individuals who can make their own decisions in the market, right? And in order to achieve that, human rights law provides them with freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, the right to liberty, freedom of association. So they're free to just pursue their own desires in the marketplace, right, without being constrained in their kind of decisions on what to buy and so on, right? So that was the left-old critique of human rights law, and there is something to that. Even if you don't want to buy into Marx's view of society wholesale, you can kind of understand what he was driving at there, right? And I think so. He was understanding human rights law as basically an expression. As he understood everything, is the kind of economic base of capitalist society. Fast forward to 2024, and I still think we can get something from that left critique of human rights law without, again, adopting kind of left-wing perspective on society wholesale, because there are definitely big economic drivers behind the way in which human rights law orients itself. So if you think about the things that human rights advocates seem to really care about the most, the things that really excite them, at the time of speaking, one is the rights of immigrants and asylum seekers. That obviously has a very, very strong economic driver, in that our current economic system is basically founded on the idea that we will import masses of essentially low-paid labour in order to drive down labour costs and kind of prop up the economic system which we currently understand and which currently works to the benefit of that class of people who most strongly find human rights law appealing. Another thing that you will notice is that human rights advocates tend to get very excited about the welfare state, and you will often see judicial review of government policy which seeks to in some way wind back the welfare state or reduce the generosity of the welfare state. And once again, the classic left critique of kind of modern liberalism, bourgeois capitalism, is that the welfare state exists to sort of kind of like buy off poor people effectively and prevent poor people from making political demands. The idea is that you simply give them a kind of bare subsistence level of living, and then if you give them that, then they'll be roughly satisfied and they won't really make any kind of political redistributive demands. So once again, you can kind of see that the economic logic kind of playing out, almost a kind of class war dynamic to the way human rights law currently operates. So it's quite, you will notice that whenever you see human rights law appearing, particularly in litigation, particularly in judicial review of government policy, but also human rights NGOs, they tend to become most prominent, or they tend to get most excited when those sorts of issues crop up. Another one is the right of protest, right? That Liberty, the famous human rights NGO, is obsessed with the right to protest. And once again, you'll notice that really serves the interests of that class, that kind of for want of a better word, kind of university educated. Matt Goodwin calls them the new elite. Right, that class is very attached to protest. They like a good protest, and it's noticeable that the human rights lobby gets very interested in the right to protest, particularly when there's some kind of pet project or a series of protests are taking place which kind of further the interests of that class. Whether that be kind of climate change, net zero protesters, or obviously we've seen recently the kind of Hamas supporting protesters. So you'll notice that as well. The right to protest has this kind of dominance in their thinking. So yeah, when you're asking, why is it that human rights law gets interested in particular causes, it often helps to think of it in that way. What are the interests that are being served here, and which classes' interests are being served here? And very often you'll find it is that class of people who Goodwin refers to as the new elite. Yeah.
Right. So think about this a bit more politically now. Obviously, in recent years, we've had what Lord Sumption calls the expanding empire of human rights law. And, that began with the ECHR in the 50s. And then we've had the Human Rights Act, which brought them more into our own domestic law. And then the Constitutional Reform Act in 2005, which brought in the Supreme Court and gave, the courts more power relative to the government. And so in against that, there's been significant pressure to potentially leave the ECHR politically. I'm wondering what you think about those kind of proposals. Is this the best way to recover sovereignty, do you think?
Yeah, well, it's that question. The problem that in practical terms is that, to give the devil his due, Tony Blair, when it wasn't he, but when Parliament, when Tony Blair was the Prime Minister, passed the Human Rights Act, it was partly doing it on the basis of achieving peace in Northern Ireland, right? Because for a long time, the nationalist community in Northern Ireland, the Catholic community in Northern Ireland, with some justification, had made the claim that the British state was violating the human rights of the population of the province, right? Particularly the nationalist communities in the province. And so respect for human rights, in effect, the ongoing existence of the Human Rights Act, is written into the Good Friday Agreement. So the idea that we could simply leave the European Convention on Human Rights, tear up the Human Rights Act, without reopening the Good Friday Agreement is for the birds. Right? That can't be done. So the very project of kind of winding in human rights either has to be done in such a way as not to result in the repeal of the Human Rights Act, right, or its replacement with an equivalent statute, or it has to be achieved through renegotiation of the Good Friday Agreement, and that would include, of course, the Irish government, it would include Sinn Féin, and it would include a very, very brave assumption that they have any interest in going into a protracted period of negotiation to reopen the Good Friday Agreement. So you got a huge practical problem there, right? That's why Dominic Raab, when he was the Minister of Justice, was so keen on having the Bill of Rights bill, right? There was method in his madness. He understood things very, very well, Dominic Raab. The reason why he wanted that Bill of Rights bill is because he knew that you couldn't just tear up the Human Rights Act and just leave the European Convention on Human Rights and that's that. Okay, you needed to replace it with something else in order to maintain some kind of a modus vivendi in Northern Ireland, right? So in purely political, kind of pragmatic terms, leaving the European Convention on Human Rights, I don't think is a realistic proposition. Apart from anything else, it would require legislation. If you're going to have legislation, then you're going to have all of the kind of parliamentary shenanigans that we had with Brexit on steroids, because it's even more of a kind of talismanic issue for the British left, right? So you'd have a huge problem achieving that politically. Dominic Raab's idea was that you could try to chart a course whereby you would keep in effect the Human Rights Act, but you'd call it something else, right? The Bill of Rights. And you could find a way to ensure that the way that the judiciary interprets human rights law is more, let's say, restrictive. It gives more space to democratic institutions, particularly to Parliament, obviously, right? And there was an awful lot of sense in that if you're thinking about it from a purely pragmatic point of view. What's also, I think, important to understand from a pragmatic point of view is that mainland Europeans are now increasingly politically coming to the same perspective that British Conservatives have had for a long time, which is that the European Convention on Human Rights needs changing. Or perhaps I should say not the European Convention on Human Rights, but the way that the European Court of Human Rights interprets the European Convention needs changing. And so there is a space opening up, I think, where British Conservatives, if they ever get back into power, right, big if, in anything like the immediate, the short to medium term future, British Conservatives, French Conservatives, Italian Conservatives, Spanish Conservatives, German Conservatives, Hungarian Conservatives, Polish Conservatives can think about a way of reforming, particularly the Strasbourg Court and how it goes about things. Because a huge, ordinary people have got no idea that this goes on, but a huge problem with the way in which the Strasbourg Court interprets the European Convention on Human Rights is something that you may have heard of called the living instrument doctrine. So the idea of that is that the European Convention on Human Rights, although it was consists of words that were written in the late 1940s and that came into effect in the early 1950s across Europe, those words, the meaning of those words changes in accordance with the way in which culture changes and society changes and politics changes. But what that actually really means in practice is that the European Court of Human Rights more or less makes things up as it goes along, because it simply says, well, yeah, society in 2024 is different to how it was in 1951. So therefore, although the convention may say such and such a thing, actually it means something different now because we live in a different time. And so that's a kind of way for the court to more or less make law from whole cloth, because it simply reinterprets the convention however it sees fit. So if there could be some consensus around restraining the court's ability to do that, then you'd immediately make a huge amount of headway in restoring power to democratic institutions. If you could just simply say to the European Court of Human Rights, sorry, you're not allowed to do that anymore. Your doctrine of interpretation has to be originalist. It has to be based on what the original drafters who wrote the text thought. You just make that clear to them, then suddenly you wouldn't have these decisions like that recent climate change madness. That wouldn't happen because that wasn't on the table in 1950. So that I think at the level of practicalities, that really has to be the approach, because I don't think, sadly, if I had my druthers, if I had a magic wand, I don't think human rights law should really exist, at least not in its current iteration. But that's not, I don't think, politically achievable. I think people have to focus on what's politically achievable, and that means finding a way to reform from within rather than just ripping it up wholesale.
So the irony being that perhaps in some ways, to be freed from the grip of the ECHR, we might actually be better off in Europe, so we could help negotiate that.
Yeah, no, yeah, so, yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Things might come full circle, and British Tories might be arguing for rejoining the EU so we can reform the Charter of Fundamental Freedoms as well. But just so people are clear, though, it's very important for people to understand that, strictly speaking, the European Convention on Human Rights has got nothing to do with the EU. Right? They're totally separate. So the European Convention on Human Rights is the baby of something called the Council of Europe, which is a much bigger umbrella organization, and it includes countries like Turkey, like Azerbaijan, those sorts of places. So actually, in a way, reforming the European Convention on Human Rights or reforming the Council of Europe system is actually easier than reforming, say, the EU, because the EU, apart from the fact that it's got much more kind of institutional clout, and the European Commission is very powerful. Apart from that reason, the Council of Europe is much bigger, and it includes quite a number of states who kind of chafe against the strictures of the convention and would quite like the idea of having a bit more kind of wiggle room with respect to how they implement human rights law. So I don't necessarily think that reform is completely impossible, or certainly much easier than David Cameron, for example, found reform of the EU essentially impossible for all intents and purposes, right? So, it's a different kettle of fish to the EU.
And that's it for the first episode of The Sceptic. Thanks for joining us, and see you again next week.